Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a part of human history that is equal parts fascinating and slightly terrifying. A time when sex wasn't a choice, it was a duty. You probably won't survive this history without a few shivers, some raised eyebrows, and maybe a slight urge to double-check your relationship agreements. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and while we're at it, I'm curious. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? It helps me picture your late-night yawns or early morning curiosity as we wander through these centuries of obligations, expectations, and sometimes absurd social rules. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself in the flickering candlelight of a Mesopotamian home, somewhere around 2000 BCE. You're newly married, and your marriage contract, yes, a literal tablet carved in cuneiform, lists not only the property exchange between families but also your sexual obligations. In this culture, your intimate life wasn't just personal, it was legally binding. The idea of "I don't feel like it tonight" simply doesn't exist. There's an ancient law code, like the Code of Hammurabi, reminding you that failing in your conjugal duties could result in financial penalties, or worse, family shame that echoes for generations. The interesting twist. While this seems draconian, historians debate whether these laws were ever enforced as strictly as the tablets suggest. Were they scare tactics to ensure social cohesion, or actual punishable infractions? We may never know, but the message is clear. Your body was, in part, a social resource. Now let's inject a quirky detail. The Egyptians had a surprisingly pragmatic view on sex in duty-bound marriages. Ancient manuals advise couples to practice love and multiplication to secure the family line, but also include tips on sneaky aphrodisiacs and positioning to maximize fertility. You're basically reading a sex guide disguised as civic instruction, which is both practical and slightly hilarious. Imagine being handed a scroll with advice on how to wiggle properly for the benefit of the state and your ancestors. Somewhere between genius and absurd, right? As we move forward, think about the sensory world around you. The scent of oil lamps, the faint rustle of linen skirts, the heavy stone walls that trap both heat and secrets. Sex here is part ritual, part duty, and part survival. For women especially, the stakes are high. They must bear children to ensure the family's legacy, while also navigating complex social hierarchies that monitor their every action. Men, meanwhile, often have multiple obligations, balancing pleasure, duty, and sometimes political maneuvering depending on their status. A single misstep could ripple across alliances and inheritance, and suddenly, your bedtime story is more like a legal thriller. There's also an intriguing open debate among scholars about the emotional lives of these couples. Were love and desire entirely suppressed by duty, or did moments of intimacy bloom organically within these structured relationships? Some suggest that in cultures with rigid sexual expectations, clandestine romances or secret joys existed as a natural counterbalance. Others argue that humans are remarkably adaptable and may have genuinely developed affection within the framework of obligation, a kind of love forged by necessity rather than choice. Either way, it complicates our modern view that passion must always precede commitment. For thousands of years, it often came after or alongside duty. Even more unexpectedly, some archaeological evidence hints at humour and human quirks in these early marriage contracts. Inscriptions sometimes include playful warnings like, "If the wife refuses, she must bring a sheep," or advice on avoiding quarrels over who sleeps where. Imagine the ancient equivalent of a couple arguing about chores, except the consequence is livestock or social disgrace. It's a reminder that humans, even under strict social rules, always found ways to inject personality, negotiation, and yes, a little mischief into their lives. By now you might be feeling a little squirmy, imagining yourself in a past where choice wasn't exactly an option. But there's a strange comfort in recognizing that duty-bound sex was never purely mechanical. Ritual, humour, strategy, and even love all intertwined, making the human experience messy, complicated, and deeply relatable. And as we glide forward into the next centuries, keep in mind that this was just the starting point. The ancient blueprint of sex as civic and marital responsibility would echo, mutate, and persist in ways that surprise even modern historians. So, as you settle deeper into your chair or bed, let the candlelight flicker in your mind's eye, and remember, this is the world where intimacy was dictated by law and society, where your body was a ledger as much as it was a source of pleasure, and where humour, cleverness, and sometimes subversive love quietly carved spaces of freedom within the framework of obligation. And with that, we gently step forward into the next chapter, where dowries, expectations, and the strange intersections of wealth and intimacy begin to dominate the story of human desire. Now, imagine you've travelled a few centuries forward, landing in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where marriage is less about finding the one and more about family strategy, wealth consolidation, and yes, mandated sexual obligations. You're no longer the playful candlelit figure from the previous section. Now you're the embodiment of social expectation, carrying a dowry in one hand and a heavy load of legal responsibility in the other. In these early societies, marriage contracts were literal legal documents that specified what each partner owed, not just in property or labour, but in bed. A husband might be obligated to provide intimacy to ensure heirs, while a wife was expected to bear children and maintain the household. Refusing even once could mean financial penalties, social humiliation, or a severing of alliances. Picture it. The idea of "I'm not in the mood" simply doesn't exist. Your desires are subordinate to the family, the state, and the gods. And if that sounds intense, well, welcome to ancient adulthood. Dowries were more than a family tradition. They were a literal sexual contract. The size of your dowry could determine how frequently your husband expected conjugal duties, or, in some cases, whether he felt justified seeking intimacy elsewhere. In Egypt, the wealthier you were, the more public the expectations of your bedroom obligations. Scholars debate whether dowries primarily served economic ends, or whether they were a socially sanctioned way to codify sexual rights. Some argue that they were essentially a currency of intimacy, a trade-off that guaranteed the wife's security while simultaneously ensuring her compliance. Others suggest that families wielded them as subtle tools of control, nudging behaviours in line with societal expectations rather than personal desire. Either way, your body becomes a social instrument, your pleasure often secondary, or at least negotiable within the framework of duty. Here's a quirky fact to lighten the mood. Ancient Egyptian couples sometimes included in their contracts humorous clauses about sex. One text advises, if the wife refuses, she must bake extra bread, turning what sounds like punishment into domestic comedy. The duality is fascinating. Marriage is rigid and legally binding, yet human nature sneaks in jokes, workarounds, and clever loopholes. It's a reminder that even under strict social rules, people found ways to soften the harsh edges of obligation with humour, food, and subtle negotiation. You might chuckle, imagining someone grudgingly kneading dough as a substitute for intimacy. Let's add sensory detail to ground you in this world. The home is constructed of mud brick and timber, the air heavy with the scent of baking bread and incense. Children play near the hearth, the chatter of family life mingling with the occasional admonition from elders. Your bed, a low wooden platform with linen bedding, feels simultaneously intimate and oppressive, a daily reminder of the legal and social expectations tied to it. Every movement, from the rising of the sun to the act of sleeping next to your spouse, is imbued with purpose beyond personal comfort. It's duty, tradition, and survival rolled into one. Historians also debate the emotional consequences of these arrangements. Were wives and husbands purely transactional in their affections, or did genuine intimacy arise from duty? Some anthropologists argue that duty created fertile ground for affection. Shared responsibilities and structured expectations sometimes nurtured closeness, even if passion was initially absent. Others counter that the stress of obligation, financial pressure, the expectation to produce heirs, and social surveillance often stifled personal connection, leaving emotional needs unmet. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Humans are adaptive creatures, capable of finding pockets of joy even under strict social and legal constraints. You might also find it interesting that Mesopotamian texts mention sexual etiquette in surprising detail. They advise couples on everything from timing and frequency to positioning and even handling disagreements. One tablet humorously warns men not to be overly forceful, or women too resistant, suggesting a keen awareness of negotiation in sexual life, even within a framework dominated by duty. It's evidence that despite the rigid social structure, Human beings were attentive to comfort, persuasion, and consent, just framed very differently than in modern culture. By this point, you're probably realizing that duty-based sex was neither uniform nor entirely joyless. It was structured, yes, but also nuanced, with layers of social expectation, humour, negotiation, and even occasional tenderness. Families, contracts, dowries, and legal codes worked together to create a network where sex was never merely personal. It was a social act, a duty to lineage, economy, and sometimes religion. And while the idea of mandatory intimacy might feel alien or even dystopian, recognizing the complexities helps you see how human relationships have always balanced desire, obligation, and survival. So as you settle deeper into this story, picture the trade-offs, the compromises, the subtle cleverness that allowed humans to navigate these strict social rules. The dowry was more than money. It was leverage, expectation, and sometimes a little comedy. Your bedroom was not only a private space, but a site of social negotiation and family strategy. And from these ancient contracts, you begin to see a pattern that echoes for millennia. Sex, at its core, has always been more than desire. It has been intertwined with duty, power, and the delicate dance between societal pressure and personal satisfaction. Now, let's shift our gaze to the curious, sometimes frustrating intersection of wealth, family, and the bedroom, dowries, and the expectations they carried. Imagine yourself as a young bride in medieval Egypt or Mesopotamia, carrying your family's carefully saved fortune to your husband's household. That dowry isn't just a sack of coins or a collection of jewellery, it's a contract, a social statement, and yes, a direct line to your sexual duties. Your new life is measured not in affection or flirtation, but in fulfillment of obligations. Every night becomes a negotiation between law, family expectation, and your own body. Historians still debate whether dowries were primarily economic instruments or social tools to enforce sexual compliance, and some suggest they were both, a dual-purpose mechanism balancing material wealth with reproductive necessity. Either way, you quickly learn that your value is measured in part by how well you meet these intimate obligations, a reality that makes modern dating look deceptively simple. The dowry also shapes the frequency and nature of marital sex. A generous dowry could create an unspoken expectation for more frequent conjugal visits, while smaller contributions might permit the husband or the family supervising him some flexibility. This isn't purely punitive. Rather, it was a carefully calculated social system to ensure heirs, maintain family alliances, and prevent disputes over inheritance. In Egypt, for example, law tablets outline a wife's rights regarding her dowry, including provisions that protect her if her husband refuses intimacy. But the overarching principle remains clear: sex is a civic duty first, and personal pleasure second. The ethical debate among historians is fascinating here. Did these rules genuinely empower women by guaranteeing certain rights, or did they simply formalize compliance under the guise of protection? It's one of those grey areas where law, culture, and human desire collide. Let's introduce a quirky detail to lighten the scholarly tension. Some dowry contracts even included clauses for bedroom efficiency. That's right. Texts advise husbands and wives to maintain regular conjugal activity for fertility purposes, with suggested intervals that almost read like a medieval calendar. There's even advice about the best times during the lunar month to maximise conception, showing that duty-based sex was surprisingly systematic. You can almost imagine an ancient couple reluctantly consulting a clay tablet before intimacy. Mercury is in retrograde. Perhaps we should wait until tomorrow. It's part practical, part ritual, and entirely human. Proof that even in highly controlled systems, people find ways to negotiate, joke, and strategize about sex. Sensory detail helps bring this world to life. You're in a courtyard scented with date palms, the air filled with the aroma of baking bread and simmering stews. Servants bustle about, children play with carved wooden toys, and the low hum of family life envelops the home. Your sleeping quarters are simple but adorned with textiles reflecting your family's contribution, silk or fine linen that subtly signals your dowry's size and by extension the expectations placed upon you. Every object, from the pottery to the bedding, reminds you of your social position and the obligations that accompany it. Your very surroundings act as a constant tactile nudge that intimacy is a duty woven into the fabric of everyday life. There's also an open debate about the psychological effects of dowry-linked sexual obligation. Some scholars argue that these systems could create resilience, teaching couples negotiation, compromise, and emotional adaptability. Others warn that such frameworks often suppressed personal desire, turning intimacy into a transactional, stress-laden act. The reality probably varies from couple to couple. Some might have discovered unexpected affection and camaraderie and shared responsibility, while others experienced resentment and emotional strain. Either way, these social structures illustrate that sex, even in ancient times, was never merely a private pleasure. It was a nexus of family, property, law, and expectation. And here's a fringe, but fascinating detail. In some cultures, families would occasionally trade sexual obligations as part of dowry arrangements, effectively negotiating the logistics of marital intimacy across households. While rare, it shows how deeply entwined economic and reproductive strategies were. These arrangements might make modern readers gasp, but for the people living them, it was simply part of navigating social survival. Imagine explaining that at a dinner party today. Oh yes, my cousin's dowry included scheduling rules for bedroom duties. The humour, the horror, and the humanity all collide. So, as you sit back and absorb this, picture the combination of law, wealth, and human ingenuity at work. The dowry is not just a financial transaction. It is a coded message about obligation, performance, and familial expectation. Every coin, cloth, or jewel carries the unspoken understanding that sex is not merely personal. It is social, legal, and sometimes even humorous. And while this world may feel alien or oppressive, it's a vital chapter in understanding how societies across time structured human intimacy, showing that our modern notions of choice, desire, and personal agency are built atop millennia of negotiation, obligation, and occasionally absurd social engineering. Now let's march north to ancient Sparta, where your bedroom life is less about romance or wealth, and more about contributing to the survival of the state. Picture yourself as a Spartan citizen, or perhaps a young bride or husband, tasked with a duty that eclipses personal preference, reproduction as a civic obligation. In Sparta, the state controlled nearly every aspect of life, and sex was no exception. Couples were encouraged to conceive strong, healthy children, especially boys, to sustain Sparta's military dominance. Romantic love was considered secondary, even distracting, and if you weren't producing heirs, you weren't just failing your family, you were failing your polis. The stakes are dizzying. Your private life exists at the intersection of civic necessity, legal expectation, and social pressure, and historians debate how this relentless focus shaped both gender relations and individual psychology in one of history's most regimented societies. The Spartan system is fascinating because it turned sex into a quasi-military duty. Citizens were expected to maintain reproductive vigour, and laws even dictated who should marry whom to preserve genetic strength. The state sometimes recommended or arranged unions based on physical and hereditary criteria, rather than affection or social compatibility. Think of it as a combination of matchmaking, eugenics, and bureaucratic control, all rolled into one. Fringe evidence suggests that the Spartan elite occasionally monitored sexual activity to ensure that it met the state's demographic goals, a level of oversight that borders on the surreal. Your bedroom is effectively a department of the state, where pleasure, while not forbidden, is subordinated to duty. Here's a quirky fact. Spartan men were known to engage in relationships outside marriage, often with other men, under the guise of mentorship or camaraderie, while still fulfilling reproductive duties with their wives. This dual system, formal reproductive obligation with spouses and socially tolerated extramarital bonds, creates a paradox that fascinates historians. Were these arrangements purely pragmatic, a workaround to human desire within rigid state structures, or did they reflect a more nuanced understanding of affection and loyalty in Spartan society? Scholars continue to debate this, highlighting how even highly regulated systems cannot entirely eliminate personal choice, humour, or subversive behaviour. Imagine the sensory details of a Spartan household. The walls are stone, austere, reflecting the city's militaristic ethos. Your bed is simple, possibly a straw mat, functional more than comfortable. The aroma of roasted meat and smoke from communal fires fills the air, mingling with the salty tang of sweat from soldiers training nearby. Children play under the watchful eyes of elders who judge their posture, strength, and agility. preparing them to become the next generation of warriors. Even in the intimacy of the bedroom, these pressures infiltrate the space. Conception is not merely desired but demanded, and both partners are acutely aware of the civic expectations placed upon them. Every act of intimacy carries the weight of Sparta's future. There's also an emotional debate among scholars. Did Spartan duty-based sex foster genuine affection, or did it reduce intimacy to a mechanical task? Some argue that state-directed expectations could erode emotional connection, producing relationships that were efficient but devoid of passion. Others suggest that these constraints may have created subtle bonds of understanding, where couples navigated state demands together, cultivating trust and mutual support within the framework of duty. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between, shaped by the personalities, circumstances, and cultural norms of each household. Here's an intriguing fringe point. Some ancient sources hint that Spartan women enjoyed greater sexual autonomy than their counterparts in other Greek city-states. Because men were frequently away for military training, women had more freedom in managing households and arranging intimate encounters, sometimes exercising choice within the strictures of duty. It's an odd juxtaposition. A society that imposes reproductive obligation on marriage also creates pockets of relative agency, reminding us that history is rarely uniform. Life, even in the most controlled environment, is messy, adaptive, and occasionally ironic. By now, you should start sensing a pattern. Duty-based sex, whether in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Sparta, is never purely oppressive or purely liberating. It's a complex dance of social expectation, legal frameworks, familial pressure, and occasional personal subversion. In Sparta, the state takes the lead, but human ingenuity and emotional subtlety still find ways to navigate, even bend, the rules. You begin to see that obligation doesn't erase desire, it reshapes it, sometimes in rigid ways, other times in surprisingly flexible forms. Your role as a citizen, spouse, and potential parent is inseparable from your sexual duties. Yet even in this regimented society, laughter, cleverness, and personal strategy persist, quietly defying the strictures of law and custom. As you lean back and absorb this, imagine the tension of a life where every private act carries civic consequence, where love is optional but reproduction is mandatory. Picture the austere stone homes, the disciplined routines, and the quiet moments of human connection that slip through the cracks of obligation. In this chapter, you see the extreme end of duty-based sex. Not merely a social expectation, but a state-mandated responsibility intertwined with survival, politics, and culture. And it sets the stage for our next exploration, where law, social norms, and marital obligation collide in the intricate world of Roman conjugal duty. Next, we step into the grandeur and sometimes absurdity of ancient Rome, where marriage is at once legal, social, and sexual, and your bedroom is under the subtle surveillance of law, custom, and gossip. Imagine yourself as a Roman husband or wife, living in a domus with mosaic floors and atriums designed to impress neighbours, clients, and visiting family. Here, sex is not entirely about passion. It is a legal and social duty codified in the very framework of marriage. Refusal could carry consequences, from public shame to financial penalty, and the expectation to produce heirs is intertwined with property rights and inheritance. You may think modern law protects your bedroom privacy, but in Rome, intimacy is a civic matter as much as it is personal. Your desires are optional, your obligations are not. Roman law, particularly under the principle of connubium, treats marital sex as a legally recognized duty. Husbands are expected to fulfill conjugal obligations, and wives have their own responsibilities, primarily to produce legitimate heirs and maintain household order. Refusal could, in extreme cases, be cited in disputes over inheritance or divorce. The ethical debate is fascinating. Some historians argue this system ensured family stability and economic continuity, while others highlight the psychological strain imposed on individuals whose desires were subordinated to social expectation. Your bedroom is essentially a legal arena, where intimacy, property, and familial duty intersect, and historians continue to debate whether this framework encouraged genuine connection or merely enforced compliance. Here's a quirky Roman detail. Ancient manuals sometimes included surprisingly detailed advice on how to maintain sexual satisfaction for duty's sake. For example, A husband might consult texts that advise on timing, posture, and even scent to encourage his wife's compliance, blending practical advice with humour and subtle social control. The Romans, ever obsessed with order and propriety, treated sex like a civic chore that could be optimised. Imagine being handed a scroll that tells you, for best results, avoid meals of lentils before intimacy. It's both strategic and slightly absurd, a window into how duty and daily life intersected in ways that feel both foreign and oddly familiar. Let's ground you in the sensory world. The domus is fragrant with the scent of olive oil and perfumes. The tiles cool underfoot as servants move quietly about, attending to daily chores. Your bed, often in a curtained room off the atrium, represents both comfort and obligation. The sounds of water from a fountain, distant conversations in the street, and the occasional clatter of a visiting client underscore the omnipresence of the public eye, even in private matters. Every act of intimacy carries not only the weight of social expectation, but also a subtle awareness of status, propriety, and legacy. Sex, in this context, is simultaneously personal, legal, and social, a balancing act that requires careful attention. There's also an intriguing scholarly debate about the emotional impact of these expectations. Did Roman couples find genuine pleasure and emotional intimacy within this legally structured system, or did they perform their duties with a kind of mechanical compliance? Some evidence, including poetry, letters, and literature, suggests that love and desire were not entirely absent. Roman culture often celebrated eroticism and romance alongside duty. Other scholars caution that the legal framework could pressure individuals, especially women, into emotionally strained situations where consent was assumed, not freely given. The tension between duty and affection becomes a recurring theme, revealing the complex human negotiation that underpins even legally mandated intimacy. And here's a fringe tidbit. Roman law allowed husbands to have sexual relations outside marriage, under certain conditions, particularly with slaves or concubines, while wives were more strictly monitored. This uneven application of sexual obligation highlights the gendered double standards that existed even in highly codified systems. It's a stark reminder that duty-based sex often came with layers of social inequality, manipulation, and strategy. Yet within these constraints, human desire and clever navigation found subtle ways to manifest. By now you should be sensing the pattern. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Sparta, and Rome, sex as duty is never purely mechanical or purely oppressive. It's a complicated web of law, social expectation, family strategy, and human creativity. The Romans, with their legalistic precision, added a dimension of civic oversight and formal codification that influenced subsequent Western notions of marital obligation for centuries. Your intimate life, whether you liked it or not, is inseparable from your social identity, property rights, and family lineage. Yet even here, humour, subtle negotiation, and occasional affection persist. As you imagine yourself in the mosaic-tiled bedroom, aware of the legal, social, and personal pressures pressing down upon you, consider how these obligations shape human relationships across cultures and eras. The Roman system illustrates that sex as duty is rarely devoid of strategy, subversion, or human complexity. Your desires may be constrained, but your ingenuity, whether through humour, compromise, or quiet acts of resistance, remains one of the few private freedoms in a world otherwise dominated by expectation. And with that, we are ready to drift into the next chapter, where the medieval church begins codifying sex as moral duty, mixing spirituality, law, and social pressure in ways that will shape Europe for centuries to come. Now let's step into the dimly lit, incense-filled world of medieval Europe, where the church isn't just a spiritual authority, it's the ultimate arbiter of your bedroom behaviour. Imagine yourself in a small stone cottage or a draughty manor, the air thick with smoke from hearth fires, listening to the distant toll of church bells. Here, sex is no longer just a family or civic duty. It has been moralised, scrutinised, and codified as a sacred obligation. Marriage is a sacrament, and conjugal sex is both a duty to your spouse and a spiritual responsibility to God. You probably won't survive this history without realising that refusal isn't just frowned upon socially, it's considered sinful. In a world where morality, law, and superstition intertwine, your intimate life becomes a minefield of spiritual, social, and practical expectations. The medieval church went so far as to establish rules governing the frequency and purpose of sexual activity. Clerical manuals instructed husbands and wives that sex should be regular enough to ensure procreation but not indulgent or excessive, lest one succumb to lust. Medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas later on debated extensively about marital duty, consent, and the moral obligations of spouses. They argued that even if desire was absent, fulfillment of marital duty was necessary to maintain the moral and social order. Here, your private life is framed as a public moral act, reinforcing both the stability of the family and the authority of the church. It's not just about making babies, it's about being righteous, obedient, and socially acceptable. Here's a quirky fact to lighten the medieval austerity. Some clergy wrote manuals advising couples on how to make duty more pleasant, recommending gentle touch, humour, and even creative positioning to encourage harmony. Imagine a priest whispering marital sex tips in Latin, half spiritual guidance, half performance coaching. It's both charmingly human and a little absurd, reflecting the tension between rigid moral rules and the reality of human intimacy. People have always found ways to navigate duty with cleverness, humour, and negotiation, even when the consequences of missteps involve divine judgment. The sensory environment of a medieval bedroom is also worth picturing. Stone walls echo with the creak of wooden beds and the soft rustle of linen. The faint smell of smoke, herbs, and unwashed clothing lingers. Candles provide dim light, flickering across tapestries and simple furnishings. Outside, the sounds of animals, wind, and distant bells remind you of the world beyond. But inside, every act of intimacy carries moral weight. Your body is not merely your own, it's a vessel of duty, morality, and social expectation, and even fleeting pleasure must be carefully negotiated within the sacred framework of the household and the church. There's an open scholarly debate about how this moralized system affected relationships. Some argue that codifying sex as duty created stability, provided clear expectations, and even fostered emotional connection within marriages. Others contend that the constant surveillance, guilt, and pressure could create anxiety, resentment, and dysfunction, particularly for women, whose consent and desire were often subordinated to spiritual and social imperatives. Evidence suggests that couples navigated this tension in various ways. Some complied out of genuine faith, some out of fear, and others subtly resisted, using humour, delay, or creative interpretation to maintain some sense of personal agency. Here's a fringe detail. Some medieval texts recommended that wives perform certain ritual gestures to encourage marital harmony, such as wearing particular colours or herbs during intimacy, blending superstition with obligation. These practices, while seemingly minor, illustrate the human desire to exert control or find comfort within strict societal rules. Even in a system dominated by religious duty, personal ingenuity and symbolic action allowed couples to claim small pockets of autonomy. By now you should see a recurring pattern. From Mesopotamia to Sparta to Rome, and now the medieval church, sex as duty evolves but retains its core features: legal, social, and moral obligations interwoven with daily life. Each society adds its own flavour: Spartan civic duty, Roman legalism, and medieval moralization. Yet the underlying tension remains consistent. Desire is secondary, obligation is primary, and human creativity, humour, negotiation, or ritual, finds ways to coexist with systemic control. In this world, every intimate encounter is layered with expectation, morality, and sometimes subtle acts of rebellion. As you imagine yourself in the flickering candlelight of a medieval home, surrounded by the smell of herbs, the hum of the hearth, and the weight of moral expectation, consider how deeply duty shaped human relationships. Intimacy is not just private pleasure, it is civic, legal, and sacred, a recurring theme across centuries. And as we move forward into the age of courtly love, you'll see how ideals of romance collide and contrast with these established duties, creating tensions that will redefine desire, affection, and obligation for generations to come. Now, let's step into the romanticized yet highly structured world of medieval Europe, where courtly love emerges like a glittering distraction amid the ever-present weight of marital duty. Imagine yourself as a young noble, surrounded by tapestries, minstrels, and the faint scent of rosewater, caught between the rigid expectations of marriage and the seductive allure of idealized romance. Courtly love is often portrayed as secret, chaste, and almost theatrical, a contrast to the very real obligations your spouse expects in the bedroom. It's an era where poetry and song celebrate longing, admiration and devotion, yet the reality of duty-based sex remains, a persistent undertone reminding you that love is optional, but obligation is mandatory. Here, you start to see the tension between cultural aspiration and societal requirement. Your heart may soar, but your bedroom remains a contract. The dichotomy between courtly love and marital duty is striking. While troubadours sing of adoration for unattainable ladies, husbands and wives are still bound by conjugal law, ecclesiastical rules, and social expectation. Scholars debate the extent to which these ideals influenced actual behaviour. Did men sneak passion into their marriages inspired by romantic ideals, or was courtly love primarily a literary and performative device, offering an escape from the drudgery of duty? Some argue that it created new vocabulary for desire, giving individuals subtle ways to express affection or rebellion, while others suggest that it reinforced patriarchal structures, codifying male fantasies while leaving women constrained by marital obligation. Either way, it adds a complex layer to the already intricate tapestry of duty-based sex. Here's a quirky detail. Medieval poetry often advised husbands on how to court their wives as if they were unattainable ladies, blending playful flirtation with obligation. One text humorously suggests complimenting her embroidery or offering rare spices before fulfilling conjugal duty, essentially turning intimacy into a performance, a negotiation between duty and charm. It's fascinating to consider that centuries before modern relationship advice columns, people were thinking about balancing pleasure, expectation, and social decorum. Humour, subtle strategy, and creativity emerge as timeless human tools for navigating intimate obligations, even in highly structured environments. Now picture the sensory world of a noble household. Heavy tapestries absorb sound, leaving rooms eerily quiet except for the rustle of gowns or the crackle of fires in stone hearths. The smell of herbs and beeswax lingers in the air, while sunlight filters through stained glass, creating dappled patterns on cold floors. In your private chamber, the bed is adorned with rich linens and embroidered cushions, a stark reminder that appearances, status, and duty are inseparable from the intimate act you're about to perform. Even moments of pleasure are framed by decorum, expectation, and hierarchy, luxury and constraint coexisting in every gesture. There's also a significant open debate among scholars about the psychological impact of courtly love on duty-based sex. Did these literary ideals create resentment, as real-world obligations fell short of poetic fantasies? Or did they provide a subtle pressure release, allowing individuals to imagine desire outside of obligation without threatening family stability? Some evidence suggests that couples incorporated elements of courtly love into their marriages, using language, ritualized gestures, and even playful teasing to cultivate intimacy within the confines of duty. Others argue that it reinforced unattainable ideals, producing frustration rather than fulfillment. Either way, the tension between fantasy and obligation becomes a defining feature of medieval intimacy. And here's a fringe but fascinating point. Some historical sources indicate that courtly love sometimes involved same-sex admiration or mentorship, further complicating the rigid structure of duty-based heterosexual marriage. These relationships, often non-sexual but emotionally charged, allowed individuals, particularly men, to experience connection, desire, and intimacy outside formal obligations. It's an early reminder that humans consistently seek ways to negotiate personal fulfillment within strict societal frameworks, and that desire is rarely fully constrained by law, religion, or custom. By now, you should see a pattern emerging. Even in an era dominated by legal, religious, and social obligations, human creativity finds ways to balance duty and desire. Courtly love adds colour and complexity to a world where sex is a duty, reminding us that even structured obligations cannot entirely suppress the human impulse for passion, play, and subtle rebellion. Your bedroom life may be codified, monitored, and morally scrutinised, but your imagination, humour, and emotional ingenuity provide a quiet, persistent countercurrent to these constraints. As you sit back and imagine your richly decorated chamber, your heart fluttering with imagined longing or playful mischief, remember that medieval Europe was a world of layered expectations. Duty persists, but so does desire, cleverly disguised or poetically expressed. And as we move forward into the more intimate and legally codified complexities of consanguinity, and arranged unions, you'll begin to see just how tangled, negotiated, and surprisingly strategic human sexual life has always been. Now let's delve into a topic that often makes modern readers raise an eyebrow: consanguinity and arranged unions. Imagine yourself as a young member of a noble or royal family in medieval Europe, where your marriage isn't about love or attraction, but about consolidating wealth, power, and influence. Your parents, advisors, and sometimes even the king have a say in whom you will marry, often directing you toward cousins or distant relatives to preserve estates, titles, or political alliances. In this world, sexual duty is unavoidable because it's intrinsically tied to family strategy. Refusing your marital obligations could disrupt dynastic plans, provoke scandal, or even spark political unrest. Here, sex is less an expression of intimacy and more a carefully monitored instrument of social continuity. Marrying within the family, often cousins or second cousins, was legally and religiously sanctioned, provided you obtained a dispensation from the church. These unions were designed to concentrate property and power, and producing legitimate heirs was paramount. From the moment the marriage contract was signed, your bedroom activities are framed by duty. The church and the law ensured that your sexual behaviour conformed to the larger goal of producing heirs and maintaining alliances. Scholars debate whether these arrangements were purely pragmatic or whether they also had psychological consequences, shaping expectations of intimacy, trust, and emotional bonds within such marriages. Some argue that familial familiarity eased tension in intimate relations, while others warn that too close kinship could produce both genetic and emotional complications. Here's a quirky detail. Some marriage contracts in medieval Europe included clauses specifying how sexual relations should be conducted within consanguineous unions. For instance, certain texts provide advice for avoiding perceived unwholesome positions or behaviours, blending superstition, health concerns, and moral duty. You can imagine a newlywed consulting their contract as a guide to marital compliance, a strange mix of instruction manual, legal decree, and spiritual warning. It's both practical and a little absurd, highlighting how seriously societies once treated the intersection of duty, morality, and sex. Now picture the sensory world of these arranged unions. The household is often large and formal, filled with the scent of burning tallow and wax mixed with faint perfumes meant to soothe or attract. Heavy curtains dampen sound, creating a private yet imposing atmosphere in your bedroom. Every object, the carved bedposts, embroidered sheets, and tapestries depicting family heraldry, reminds you of your social obligations. Even moments of intimacy are imbued with the weight of lineage, family honour, and expectation. Your body is no longer just yours. It is a tool for maintaining alliances, securing estates, and producing heirs. There's also a persistent scholarly debate about how arranged, consanguineous marriages affected emotional bonds. Did couples find intimacy and affection over time, or were they trapped in relationships defined almost entirely by duty and expectation? Evidence suggests both outcomes. Some couples developed deep trust, camaraderie, and even love, often navigating their shared obligations with humour or ritual. Others experienced tension, resentment, or emotional distance, constrained by the weight of familial and political demands. The diversity of experiences highlights the adaptability and resilience of human relationships, even under rigid duty-bound frameworks. Here's a fringe but fascinating point. Some records hint that medieval couples engaged in subtle acts of personal agency even within these tightly controlled unions, such as negotiating bed arrangements, using humour, or incorporating small rituals to increase comfort or intimacy. These small acts of rebellion or adaptation show that human desire persists, even under the strictest societal constraints. Duty may define the framework, but individual creativity, humour, and negotiation carve out personal space within it. By now, the pattern is becoming clearer. Across history, duty-based sex is rarely monolithic. From Mesopotamia to medieval Europe, personal desire constantly negotiates, adapts, and occasionally subverts the structures imposed by family, law, or society. Consanguinity and arranged marriages may feel alien today, but they reflect a recurring principle. Sexual obligation is inseparable from social, political, and economic priorities. Your bedroom life, even in the most intimate settings, is never merely private. It's a nexus of expectation, strategy, and subtle negotiation. As you imagine yourself navigating this tightly controlled world, balancing duty, family loyalty and personal emotion, you start to see the long arc of sexual obligation. Choice is constrained, but human ingenuity finds ways to assert itself, whether through humour, ritual, or emotional subtlety. And with that, we are ready to move into the Renaissance, where morality manuals and cultural shifts begin to codify intimate life in new, sometimes surprising ways. Now let's drift into the Renaissance, a period of glittering art, humanistic philosophy, and surprisingly, meticulously codified sexual behaviour. Picture yourself in Italy or France in the 15th century, surrounded by frescoed walls, marble floors, and the scent of candle wax mingled with rosewater. Here, sex is still largely a duty, but it's framed by an emerging cultural obsession with morality, refinement, and self-control. Marriage manuals and conduct books proliferate, offering detailed guidance on how spouses should behave in bed, manage intimacy, and fulfill reproductive obligations. Your pleasure may not be the priority, procreation and social harmony are, but these texts recognize human desire and even try, in awkwardly charming ways, to make duty more tolerable. It's a world where morality and practicality collide in soft candlelight, quills scratching advice onto carefully illuminated pages. Renaissance conduct manuals reveal fascinating details about how duty-based sex was conceptualized. For example, they instructed husbands to avoid being overly forceful, wives to accept marital obligations graciously, and both partners to cultivate harmony through patience and attentiveness. These texts sometimes included bizarre, almost fetishistic advice, suggesting specific scents, bedtime timing, and even positions believed to enhance fertility. Scholars debate the extent to which these manuals reflected actual practice versus idealized prescriptions meant to instruct a morally aspirational elite. Some argue that such guides offered couples a framework for negotiation, subtly encouraging consent and mutual pleasure within duty, while others see them as another layer of social control, reinforcing obligations under the guise of moral refinement. Here's a quirky detail. One Renaissance text humorously instructs husbands to approach gently, like a cat upon the hearth, blending domestic imagery with sexual advice. You can almost hear an author sighing with exasperation at human reluctance, while trying to make intimacy a chore that is somehow civilized, safe, and effective. It's a reminder that humans have always tried to codify intimacy, yet humor and metaphor slip in, revealing our desire to soften even the strictest rules with creativity and charm. Now, imagine the sensory world of a Renaissance bedroom. Rich tapestries hang on the walls, muted the echoes of the bustling street outside. The scent of perfumed oils, beeswax candles, and polished wood fills the space. The bed is often a massive canopy with embroidered linens, reminding you that social status, wealth, and duty are inseparable from intimacy. Even a private act is framed by aesthetic, symbolic, and practical considerations. Your movements, choices, and timing are guided by manuals, tradition, and subtle cues about propriety, making each encounter both a duty and a carefully choreographed performance. There's an open debate among historians about how Renaissance morality manuals affected marital relations. Some argue that these texts empowered couples with knowledge and strategies to navigate obligations more harmoniously, creating a subtle bridge between duty and mutual satisfaction. Others suggest that the overwhelming prescriptive nature of the manuals could create anxiety, guilt, or resentment, especially for women whose bodies and desires were tightly monitored. It's likely a mixture. Some households may have adopted these practices with humour and adaptability, while others adhered rigidly, producing tension and constraint. A fringe yet fascinating point. Some Renaissance medical treatises linked sexual behaviour directly to health, claiming that regular, duty-bound intimacy could balance humours, prevent disease, and even improve cognitive function. This fusion of science, morality, and obligation underscores how deeply sex was intertwined with everyday life, beyond pleasure or reproduction. Your bedroom, in this context, becomes a site of medical, moral, and social performance, a space where multiple layers of expectation overlap. By now, a clear pattern emerges. Duty-based sex persists across centuries, but societies add new layers, legal, moral, literary, and medical, each reflecting evolving cultural priorities. In the Renaissance, we see a curious tension: intimacy as obligation, yet increasingly nuanced by desire, knowledge, and human creativity. Humour, ritual, and clever adaptation continue to mediate duty, showing that even in prescriptive systems, human beings find ways to negotiate, personalise, and occasionally subvert expectation. As you picture yourself navigating the soft candlelight, reading advice on how to approach your spouse with gentle attentiveness, consider how duty and desire intermingle, shaping the intimate and emotional contours of Renaissance households. And with that, we're ready to move into a darker, more paranoid world, the witch hunts, where refusal of marital duty could be entangled with accusations of deviance, fear, and social control. Now brace yourself, because we're entering a period where sex as duty collides with fear, superstition, and outright persecution, the era of the European witch hunts. Imagine yourself in a small village in the 16th or 17th century Germany, France, or England, where every glance, rumour, or refusal can spiral into suspicion. In this world, marital sex is not just a private obligation. It is socially scrutinised, morally enforced, and sometimes weaponised. Husbands expect compliance, wives are watched for signs of reluctance, and the church or local authorities may interpret refusal as evidence of spiritual corruption or even witchcraft. You probably won't survive this history without acknowledging how terrifying it was to navigate duty under the looming threat of accusation. Your body is a site of obligation, fear, and power, and failure to meet expectations could have catastrophic consequences. During this period, sexual refusal, particularly by women, was sometimes cited as evidence of witchcraft or moral deviance. Trials often linked infertility, marital conflict, or reluctance to consummate to supernatural influence. In this way, duty-based sex was enforced not just socially or legally, but existentially. Failing to perform conjugal duties could endanger life and reputation. Historians debate how much of this persecution was genuinely about fear of witchcraft versus social control. Some argue that accusations of sexual non-compliance were a tool to reinforce patriarchal authority and suppress women's autonomy, while others highlight the complex interplay of religious zeal, local politics, and genuine superstition. Either way, sexual obligation becomes inseparable from survival and social standing. Here's a quirky, yet unsettling detail. Some trial records note that accused women were tested by examining their sexual availability or knowledge of supposed erotic magic. While horrifying by modern standards, these practices underscore how deeply duty, desire, and social control were intertwined. You can imagine the psychological tension of existing in a society where every intimate encounter is both a performance of obligation and a potential site of accusation. Even the most private acts are entangled with fear, power, and the gaze of authority. Picture the sensory world of these villages. Stone cottages smell of smoke, livestock, and damp earth. The air carries tension, whispers of neighbours, the distant toll of church bells, and the occasional clatter of guards or inquisitors. Within your modest bedroom, intimacy is overshadowed by anxiety. The bed, once a site of connection, now feels like a stage for scrutiny. Every refusal, hesitation, or even subtle display of emotion could ripple outward, drawing suspicion or gossip. Duty-based sex in this climate is a matter of survival as much as reproduction. There's a persistent scholarly debate about the psychological toll of this environment. Some argue that fear of accusation created extreme stress, anxiety, and repression, particularly for women, shaping patterns of intimacy, compliance, and avoidance. Others note that communities sometimes developed coded ways of negotiating consent and desire, using humour, ritual, or subtle resistance to navigate these pressures. The tension between obligation, fear, and personal agency illustrates the precariousness of sexual life under systemic scrutiny. And here's a fringe point. Some records suggest that women accused of witchcraft sometimes use knowledge of sexual matters, fertility rituals, herbal aphrodisiacs, or charm-making, as leverage to assert influence or negotiate safety. In a bizarre twist, the very knowledge that placed them at risk could also become a tool of subtle power, demonstrating that human ingenuity persists even in terrifying circumstances. Duty, fear, and strategy become entangled, revealing both oppression and adaptation. By now, you should see how history layers social, religious, and political pressures onto intimate life. Across centuries, duty-based sex is never simply personal. It is legal, social, moral, and, in extreme cases, deadly. Witch hunts illustrate the high stakes of non-compliance. Refusal can threaten not only marriage and family but life itself, and yet, even here, subtle negotiation, clever adaptation, and human creativity persist, showing the resilience of individual agency under intense pressure. As you imagine yourself in a dark, candlelit cottage, the flicker of the hearth casting long shadows on the walls, remember that intimacy was never purely private. Duty, fear, and social control permeate every interaction. And as we move forward, we'll see how colonial societies inherited and reshaped these obligations, blending survival, reproduction, and social expectation in strange and sometimes coercive ways. Now let's travel across the Atlantic to the colonial Americas, where sex as duty takes on an entirely new set of pressures. Imagine yourself as a settler in the 17th century, living in a cramped, drafty cabin surrounded by dense forest, unfamiliar wildlife, and the constant threat of hunger or disease. Here, intimacy is not merely a marital or moral obligation. It is tied directly to survival, reproduction, and the continuation of your fledgling community. The harsh environment and high mortality rates mean that producing children isn't optional. It's necessary for labour, defence, and the perpetuation of the colony. You probably won't survive this history without recognising how physical necessity and social expectation converge, making sex a duty in the most practical sense imaginable. Colonial leaders often emphasised the moral and civic responsibility of settlers to reproduce. Marriage was tightly regulated by church and civil authorities, and failure to fulfil conjugal obligations could be interpreted as both sinful and socially dangerous. In New England, for instance, ministers occasionally admonished couples for neglecting their marital duties, framing procreation as both spiritual and civic service. Scholars debate the extent to which these admonitions were effective or more performative than practical. Some argue that they reflect genuine concern for community survival, while others suggest they reinforced patriarchal control, codifying intimate behaviour in ways that limited personal agency, especially for women. Here's a quirky colonial detail. Some household manuals and sermons advised couples to time intimacy with agricultural cycles, suggesting that conception should coincide with seasons favourable to child rearing and labour needs. Imagine a preacher reminding newlyweds that their duty extends not only to God and spouse, but to the colony itself, linking bedroom activity to the planting of crops and tending of livestock. It's an odd fusion of survival strategy, moral obligation, and reproductive planning, highlighting how sex was deeply entwined with the practicalities of colonial life. Now picture the sensory environment. Your cabin is small, with walls that creak in the wind and floors that groan underfoot. The smell of wood smoke mingles with the tang of preserved meats and the earthy aroma of nearby fields. Children play or work nearby, and the sounds of labour, axes chopping wood, animals braying, distant rivers rushing, fill the air. In this setting, intimacy is both private and immediately practical. Each child contributes to labour, defence, and the long-term survival of the family and settlement. Duty-based sex is not an abstract moral concept here. It is intertwined with everyday life, survival, and communal expectation. There's also an ongoing scholarly debate about how these pressures shaped relationships. Did couples find unexpected affection and mutual reliance in this environment, or did stress, scarcity, and coercion lead to tension and resentment? Evidence suggests both. Some settlers formed strong bonds under shared hardship, using humour, negotiation, and subtle strategies to maintain intimacy, while others experienced conflict and emotional strain, constrained by environmental, social, and religious pressures. Duty, necessity, and desire are interwoven in ways that complicate simple moral narratives. Here's a fringe but fascinating detail. Some colonial women reportedly used herbal remedies and domestic knowledge to exert subtle influence over sexual timing and fertility, navigating duty with small acts of personal agency. These strategies, sometimes hidden from husbands or community elders, show that even in societies of extreme obligation, individual creativity persists. Human desire and negotiation carve out spaces of autonomy, however limited within broader structures of survival and social expectation. By now, a pattern emerges. Across continents and centuries, sex as duty adapts to context. In colonial settlements, it becomes inseparable from survival, labour, and community continuity. You start to see that obligation is never purely legal or moral. It is often practical, deeply social, and embedded in the material realities of daily life. Your bedroom is both private and public, intimate and utilitarian, a place where personal agency negotiates with survival, morality, and social expectation. As you imagine the creaking cabin, the smoky hearth, and the constant demands of colonial life pressing in from all sides, you begin to understand how historical context shapes sexual duty. It is never simply about desire. It is entwined with reproduction, labour, survival, and social order. And as we move forward, we will explore the more formalised systems of sexual obligation in Imperial China, where concubinage and bureaucracy transform intimacy into a tool of governance. Now, let's travel east to Imperial China, where sex as duty takes on a bureaucratic and highly stratified form. Imagine yourself as a young man in the Ming or Qing dynasty, or perhaps a concubine navigating the gilded yet rigid corridors of a wealthy household. Here, intimacy is not simply a marital or romantic act. It is a formalised duty embedded in social hierarchy, family strategy, and imperial bureaucracy. The emperor's harem itself is a microcosm of duty-based sex. Concubines are selected not for mutual affection, but for beauty, family connections, and political advantage, their sexual availability regulated by strict rules and schedules. You probably won't survive this history without realising that in such a world, your body is both a tool of statecraft and a locus of personal negotiation, survival, and occasional ingenuity. In imperial households, sexual duty was codified in both law and custom. Wives and concubines were expected to bear children, particularly sons, to secure family lineage, inheritance, and social standing. Husbands, meanwhile, had obligations to rotate attention among multiple partners, guided by etiquette manuals and household rules. Scholars debate whether these obligations were experienced as coercion, ritual, or even opportunity. Some argue that concubines had little choice and were subjected to exploitation, while others suggest that the most favoured women wielded subtle influence within the household, negotiating attention, gifts, and privileges. Either way, the system transforms intimacy into a form of social currency. Here's a quirky detail. Some Ming Dynasty etiquette manuals provide explicit schedules for when each concubine could expect attention, down to the hour, based on lunar cycles and astrological advice. Imagine being assigned a night like a civil servant is assigned a shift, your bedroom life functioning as a mix of ritual, duty, and bureaucratic order. It's both methodical and strangely human, reflecting the desire to regulate reproduction while managing complex social hierarchies. Even within these rigid structures, individuals found ways to assert preference, cleverness, or playful negotiation. Picture the sensory world. The palace or household is a labyrinth of polished wood, incense smoke, and soft silk underfoot. The air is fragrant with flowers, candles, and perfumed oils, while the faint rustle of servants and eunuchs creates a constant background hum. The bedrooms themselves are both luxurious and intimidating. Canopies, cushions, and curtains surround spaces where intimate acts are performed under strict protocols. Every movement, touch, and conversation is suffused with expectation, hierarchy, and sometimes covert strategy. Your body is deeply intertwined with social order, duty, and performance, and even pleasure must be navigated carefully within this rigid framework. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about emotional and psychological outcomes for those living within this system. Did concubines develop attachments, friendships, or rivalries that tempered the impersonality of duty? Did husbands cultivate affection for some wives while remaining dutiful to others? Evidence suggests a spectrum. Some households nurtured genuine bonds, companionship, and mutual care, while others operated with strict utilitarian focus, leaving desire, affection, or autonomy severely constrained. These dynamics underscore that even highly structured systems of sexual duty cannot erase the complexities of human emotion. And here's a fringe but fascinating point. Some concubines reportedly used wit, charm, and strategic alliances to influence their position, secure gifts, or negotiate timing for intimacy, effectively carving small spaces of personal agency within rigid hierarchies. These acts of subtle negotiation reveal that human ingenuity persists, even under intense social control. Duty, hierarchy, and bureaucracy dominate the framework, but personal strategy, humour, and interpersonal skill remain tools for navigating constraints. By now, you should recognise a recurring theme. Across time and culture, duty-based sex is never purely legal or coercive. It is interwoven with hierarchy, social strategy, and personal negotiation. In imperial China, as in Mesopotamia, Sparta, Rome, and Europe, obligations shape intimate life, but human creativity, humour, and subtlety persist. The bedroom becomes a site of duty, ritual, survival, and social performance, where personal agency finds ways to assert itself within broader constraints. As you imagine silk curtains, polished wood, and incense smoke filling the air, consider how deeply structured obligation shapes desire, negotiation, and survival. Duty in this context is formalised, public in consequence, and intimately personal in execution. And as we move forward, we'll explore the lives of indentured servants and their intimate obligations in colonial societies, where survival, labour, and sexual duty collide in even more complicated ways. Now, let's step into the cramped, sun-baked quarters of European indentured servants in the Americas, where sex as duty takes on a grim, practical, and often coercive character. Imagine yourself as a young servant, your body effectively rented to a master for a fixed number of years, navigating a world where survival, labour, and reproduction are tightly interwoven. Marriage is rarely a matter of choice. Partners are assigned or tolerated based on labour needs, and sexual obligations are often dictated by economic, social, or practical considerations. You probably won't survive this history without recognising the harsh reality. Intimacy is not merely personal or marital. It is a condition of survival, and, in many cases, a tool of social control. Indentured servants faced explicit and implicit sexual expectations. Female servants, in particular, were vulnerable to coercion, with masters sometimes leveraging authority over food, shelter, or contract terms to demand compliance. Men, meanwhile, were expected to marry or partner strategically to produce children who could labour on the plantation or farm. Scholars debate whether these systems can be viewed purely as coercive or if a spectrum of negotiation existed. Some argue that survival and social mobility necessitated compliance, while others highlight subtle strategies used by servants to assert personal agency, delay obligations, or navigate intimacy with humour, discretion, or tactical resistance. Either way, sexual duty was inseparable from daily life, survival, and hierarchy. Here's a quirky but unsettling detail. Some indentured households maintained marriage schedules or expectations about reproduction, often tied to labour needs rather than emotional connection. For instance, authorities or family heads sometimes encouraged unions timed to optimise birth rates during particular seasons, when extra labour was essential. Imagine consulting a calendar for not only planting and harvest, but also conception duties, a grim reminder that reproductive obligation was deeply entwined with economic survival. Humour or resistance may have softened these rules, but the structural pressure remained intense and unyielding. Now, picture the sensory reality of life in these quarters. Wooden shacks or small cabins smell of smoke, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Labourers move wearily through fields, carrying baskets of crops, axes, or water, while the distant clatter of tools and animals fills the air. Within the bedroom, or whatever serves as sleeping space, intimacy occurs under constraint, often in crowded, uncomfortable conditions. Privacy is limited, and duty is ever present. Sexual activity, while a human impulse, is also a transaction, a means of survival, and a reflection of social hierarchies, making every act of intimacy complex, pressured, and highly strategic. There's a persistent scholarly debate about emotional life under these conditions. Did couples form genuine bonds, camaraderie, or affection as a coping mechanism, or were relationships purely pragmatic, formed under coercion and necessity? Evidence suggests a mixture. Some partnerships cultivated genuine care, humour, and shared resilience, while others were fraught with tension, resentment, and imbalance, constrained by economic and social pressures. Duty, survival, and desire were entangled in ways that challenged modern assumptions about intimacy and consent. And here's a fringe but fascinating point. Some indentured women reportedly used domestic skills, charm, or covert negotiation to influence the timing, conditions, or frequency of sexual obligations, subtly asserting autonomy within rigid constraints. These acts, while often small, highlight the enduring human desire for agency, pleasure, or control, even in the harshest environments. It's a reminder that duty never fully eliminates ingenuity, humour, or subtle forms of resistance. By now, you should see that duty-based sex adapts to context. In colonial indentured life, survival, labour, and reproduction dominate, but human strategy, negotiation, and subtle subversion persist. Your intimate life is never entirely private. It is entwined with hierarchy, necessity, and social expectation, reflecting the complex interplay of coercion and creativity that shapes sexual obligation throughout history. As you imagine cramped cabins, sweat-soaked fields, and nights of both intimacy and tension, consider how sexual duty intersects with survival and labour. It is never purely romantic or recreational. Every act carries social, economic, and pragmatic weight. And as we move forward, we'll explore the Enlightenment, where philosophers begin debating personal liberty versus marital obligation, adding a new intellectual dimension to centuries of sexual duty. Now, let's enter the Age of Enlightenment, a time when salons buzz with philosophy, reason, and debate, yet marital sex remains deeply entwined with duty. Imagine yourself in Paris, London, or Vienna in the 18th century, sipping weak tea in a candlelit drawing room, surrounded by thinkers who argue passionately about freedom, morality, and human nature. Philosophers from Locke to Rousseau ponder personal liberty, consent, and natural rights. But in the bedroom, marital obligations persist. Your desires may be discussed in theory, but in practice, you are still expected to fulfill conjugal duties, produce heirs, and maintain household stability. Here, sex exists at the crossroads of intellectual freedom and social expectation, and you probably won't survive this history without seeing the contradictions that arise when philosophy meets centuries of tradition. Enlightenment thinkers brought new scrutiny to sexual obligations, questioning whether duty-based intimacy should be strictly enforced or whether personal desire could have moral and social weight. Some argued that marriage should balance duty with affection, advocating for mutual satisfaction as part of moral and emotional development. Others defended traditional obligations, warning that unchecked liberty could threaten family stability and social order. Historians debate the extent to which these debates influenced actual behaviour. Did philosophical discourse change bedroom practices, or were these ideas largely abstract, entertaining the elite while the majority of families continued centuries-old patterns of obligation? The tension between theory and practice is central. Desire is discussed, but duty remains real. Here's a quirky Enlightenment detail. One French pamphlet humorously recommended that husbands who neglect their duty risk not only divine wrath, but domestic mockery, suggesting that moral philosophy, social expectation, and humour intersected in guiding sexual behaviour. You can imagine gentlemen and ladies reading these texts with a mix of curiosity, embarrassment, and wry amusement. Even as thinkers debated liberty and consent, human beings continued to seek strategies to make obligations tolerable, or at least less awkward. Humour and subtle negotiation remain key tools for navigating intimate duty. Now, picture the sensory world of an Enlightenment household. Heavy drapes and polished wood reflect candlelight, the scent of spiced tea and wax mingling in the air. The faint murmur of conversation from the salon mixes with the quiet steps of servants, creating a constant awareness of social surveillance. Bedrooms are relatively comfortable compared to previous centuries, but the weight of expectation is palpable. Producing heirs, maintaining social reputation, and fulfilling moral obligations all converge in what might otherwise seem private moments. Your body, while capable of desire, is still a vehicle for duty, social stability, and philosophical experiment. There's also an ongoing scholarly debate about the psychological effects of Enlightenment thinking on marital intimacy. Did these ideas create greater negotiation, mutual understanding, and satisfaction? Or did the contrast between lofty ideals and daily practice produce frustration and guilt? Some historians suggest that couples experimented with new ways of balancing duty and desire, inspired by intellectual discourse, while others argue that old patterns persisted, showing how deeply entrenched social structures often resist philosophical critique. Either way, the period illustrates an emerging awareness that sexual obligation and personal liberty can coexist in tension rather than total conflict. A fringe but intriguing detail. Some Enlightenment-era households reportedly conducted informal contracts of affection, written or verbal agreements that outlined expectations for intimacy, household cooperation, and mutual respect. These agreements, while not legally binding, reveal attempts to formalize negotiation, humour, and compromise within traditional frameworks of duty. It's an early example of humans striving to assert agency, consent, and mutuality within socially imposed structures. By now, the pattern is clear. From Mesopotamia to Enlightenment Europe, duty-based sex evolves but retains its essential tension. Desire, obligation, and negotiation intersect, with each era adding cultural, philosophical, or strategic layers. In this period, intellectual discourse begins to frame duty as a moral and social choice, highlighting both the constraints and opportunities within marital intimacy. The bedroom, as ever, is a complex space where human ingenuity, humour and emotion negotiate centuries of expectation. As you imagine candlelight flickering across polished tables and heavy curtains, think of how philosophers debated liberty, while families continued to navigate duty in practical, emotional, and often subtle ways. And as we move forward, we'll explore the strict codes of Victorian morality, where social pressure, secrecy, and covert sexual expectation create an entirely new layer of tension in marital life. Now let's enter the peculiar and often paradoxical world of Victorian England, where public morality and private obligation collide in ways that can feel almost absurd to modern sensibilities. Picture yourself in a candlelit London townhouse or a countryside manor, surrounded by heavy curtains, polished mahogany, and the faint scent of beeswax and lavender. Society demands that you appear restrained, modest, and proper, yet beneath this polished surface sexual duty persists. Husbands expect conjugal compliance, wives are obliged to produce heirs, and any deviation from these expectations is cloaked in secrecy and sometimes guilt. You probably won't survive this history without feeling the tension between the outwardly rigid moral codes and the very real private expectations that continue to shape intimacy. Victorian sexual norms were heavily influenced by religion, medical theories, and social convention. Manuals and advice books proliferated, instructing wives to endure marital obligations patiently, while husbands were cautioned against excessive passion that might weaken their wives. Scholars debate whether these texts were practical guides, moralistic propaganda, or a combination of both. Some argue they codified marital obligations in a way that reinforced female passivity and male dominance, while others suggest they offered subtle strategies for negotiation, humour, and compromise, allowing couples to navigate duty with greater tact. Either way, sex remained a duty, a performance, an obligation, and a source of anxiety, even in a culture that outwardly celebrated restraint. Here's a quirky Victorian detail. Some manuals offered advice on how to make duty-based intimacy more tolerable by using cold water, herbal infusions, or even electrical devices intended to stimulate or regulate the bedroom encounter. Imagine reading that at a parlour table, the author deadpan serious while giving instructions that feel simultaneously practical, peculiar, and slightly humorous. The mix of medical science, social expectation, and a touch of whimsy shows that even in rigid systems, humans sought ways to negotiate pleasure, compliance, and creativity within constraints. Now, picture the sensory world of a Victorian household. Heavy draperies mute street noise, polished floors creak underfoot, and the faint aroma of tea, soap, and candle smoke lingers. Bedrooms are both private and symbolic. Beds with high canopies, embroidered linens, and ornate furniture signal status while framing intimate acts within strict decorum. Every touch, movement, or gesture carries expectation, a subtle negotiation between duty and propriety. The tension between public virtue and private obligation is omnipresent, making each encounter a balancing act between societal pressure and personal agency. Historians also debate the emotional consequences of these rigid expectations. Some argue that the strict moral codes and emphasis on restraint created anxiety, repression, and dissatisfaction, particularly for women whose autonomy and intimacy was constrained. Others note that couples often found clever strategies to maintain affection, humour, or subtle negotiation within the rules, such as coded communication, playful gestures, or private rituals. Victorian duty-based sex, while outwardly constrained, still allowed room for human adaptability, ingenuity, and occasional covert enjoyment. A fringe but fascinating point. Some Victorians engaged in elaborate systems of secret joys or private rituals, such as discreet letters, coded messages, or hidden trysts, to navigate obligations while preserving social propriety. These small acts of resistance or creativity reveal that duty never fully suppresses human desire, agency, or emotional ingenuity. The bedroom may be a site of compliance, but it also becomes a subtle arena for negotiation, humour, and personal expression. By now, the pattern is clear. Across time and culture, duty-based sex persists, yet humans constantly negotiate, subvert, or adapt to constraints. In Victorian England, moral rigour and secrecy create a new layer of complexity, illustrating how societal norms, gender roles, and intimate obligations intersect. Desire, duty, and ingenuity coexist, often in tension but sometimes harmoniously, revealing the enduring interplay of social expectation and human creativity. As you imagine heavy curtains, the faint glow of candlelight, and the whispered negotiation of obligations behind closed doors, consider how Victorian society codified intimacy, yet left room for subtle, ingenious acts of personal agency. And as we move forward, we'll explore the Industrial Revolution, where urbanisation, labour, and changing social structures introduce new pressures and negotiations around sexual duty. Now, let's step into the crowded, smoke-filled streets of the Industrial Revolution, where duty-based sex is reshaped by urbanisation, labour demands, and the pressures of modernising society. Picture yourself in a bustling 19th century city, the constant hum of factories, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the smell of coal smoke and sweat thick in the air. Your home is small, often cramped, and privacy is scarce. Here, sex as duty is not only about producing heirs or fulfilling moral expectations, it's entangled with survival, economic necessity, and the strain of relentless urban life. You probably won't survive this history without realising that the pressures of industrial work, crowded living, and societal expectation fundamentally transformed intimate life. Urbanisation intensified the obligations of marital sex in new ways. Couples who once lived on expansive rural estates, with space and time to negotiate intimacy, now find themselves in small tenements or row houses, often sharing walls with neighbours and contending with poor ventilation, heat, and noise. Historians debate how these conditions influenced marital satisfaction. Some argue that proximity and necessity fostered emotional bonds and creative negotiation, while others suggest that stress, exhaustion, and cramped conditions amplified tension, conflict, and duty-driven compliance. Regardless, intimacy becomes a practical negotiation amid social, economic, and physical constraints, with each encounter influenced by the environment as much as by obligation. Here's a quirky Industrial Revolution detail. Advice manuals of the period sometimes recommended timing sexual activity to coincide with workers' shifts, energy levels, or even the household's heating schedule. Some suggested avoiding intimacy immediately after exhausting work in factories or mills, while others framed bedroom duty as a civic responsibility to maintain family productivity and social order. Imagine a household calendar that combines paydays, laundry, factory shifts, and reproductive obligations. It sounds absurdly modern and bureaucratic, yet it reflects the practical realities of balancing duty and survival under industrial pressures. Now, picture the sensory world. The tenement smells of coal smoke, damp laundry, and cooking stews, mingling with the faint scent of body odour from crowded rooms. Children play or nap nearby, their noises threading through walls and floors. Your bedroom, or whatever space you claim for sleep and intimacy, is small, functional, and often lacking privacy. Candles or gas lamps provide dim light, flickering across bare floors and sparse furnishings. Within this environment, sexual duty is intimately connected to daily survival, fatigue, and social expectation. Every act of intimacy is both private and socially framed, a balancing act between necessity, desire, and obligation. Historians continue to debate how industrialization affected marital intimacy psychologically and emotionally. Did couples adapt creatively, finding humour, affection, or subtle negotiation strategies within cramped, stressful conditions? Or did exhaustion, economic pressure, and social surveillance produce resentment and emotional distance? Evidence suggests a mix. Some households developed rituals, jokes, and small comforts that softened obligation, while others adhered rigidly to duty-driven expectations, with stress amplifying tension. The interplay of labour, survival, and obligation shaped intimate life in unprecedented ways. Here's a fringe yet fascinating point. Some 19th century manuals recommended practical devices to make duty-based sex more manageable, including adjustable beds, comfort cushions, or even herbal tonics to enhance fertility or vitality after long days of labour. It's a reminder that human creativity and practical problem-solving persist even under extreme constraint. Duty remains, but strategy, humour, and subtle agency continue to carve space within it. By now, you can see a consistent pattern. Duty-based sex evolves with context but never disappears. From the open spaces of rural households to crowded urban tenements, human ingenuity, humour, and subtle negotiation shape intimate life within frameworks of obligation, survival, and social expectation. In the Industrial Revolution, intimacy is a practical negotiation as much as a social or moral one, highlighting the adaptive strategies that couples employ under constraint. As you imagine flickering gas lamps, the smell of coal and stew, and the soft creaks of narrow floorboards, consider how industrial pressures reshaped marital obligation. Sex is no longer only moral, legal, or civic. It's entwined with survival, fatigue, and environmental conditions, requiring creativity and negotiation at every turn. And as we move forward, we'll examine the legal frameworks of the 19th century, where courts begin to intervene in sexual obligations, adding yet another layer of expectation, negotiation, and potential conflict. Now let's explore the 19th century legal landscape, where duty-based sex increasingly intersects with courts, property laws, and divorce proceedings. Imagine yourself as a married person in Victorian England or the United States, facing not just familial or social expectations, but also the scrutiny of judges, lawyers, and statutes. Marital sex is not simply a personal or private matter. It carries legal weight, particularly when questions of inheritance, property, or marital fidelity arise. Husbands might bring suit if wives refuse conjugal duties, while wives could invoke neglect in some cases to claim protection or support. You probably won't survive this history without seeing how deeply sex as duty was embedded in the law, shaping intimate life in ways both overt and subtle. Legal codes often codified sexual obligations explicitly, linking them to marital contracts and property rights. In England, the Matrimonial Causes Act and other statutes treated refusal of sexual duty as grounds for divorce or legal intervention. Similarly, in the United States, courts sometimes considered non-consummation or refusal of intimacy in deciding property disputes, custody, or alimony. Scholars debate whether these legal frameworks empowered individuals or primarily reinforced male authority. Some argue that they provided women with leverage in negotiations over marital compliance, while others contend that they entrenched patriarchal control, making refusal difficult or socially unacceptable. Either way, law transforms the bedroom into a site of formal accountability, extending obligation into public legal arenas. Here's a quirky detail. Some legal treatises of the period suggested literally counting instances of marital intercourse as evidence in divorce cases, a blend of absurdity, obsession, and social control. Imagine a lawyer presenting testimony on whether duty was adequately performed, as if intimacy could be quantified on a ledger. It's both comical and unsettling, revealing the lengths to which societies have attempted to regulate private life. Humour, human judgment, and anxiety are inseparably entwined in this legal oversight of intimacy. Now picture the sensory world in which this unfolds. A courtroom smells faintly of polished wood, ink, and human nerves, echoing with measured voices and the rustle of papers. Meanwhile, the home, the bedroom where these duties are performed, is imbued with social, legal, and moral significance. Curtains, furnishings, and domestic objects silently testify to status, propriety, and the weight of law, while even fleeting refusals or lapses in duty carry consequences that ripple through family, property, and society. Intimacy is private, yet simultaneously public, performative, and accountable. There's a persistent scholarly debate about the psychological consequences of this legalized oversight. Did formalized accountability foster fairness, negotiation, or emotional consideration, giving spouses language to assert needs? Or did it create stress, fear, and mechanized compliance, reducing intimacy to performance and obligation? Evidence suggests both. Some couples leveraged legal structures to protect autonomy, while others experienced heightened tension and surveillance, illustrating the complex interplay of law, obligation, and personal agency. Duty is no longer simply social or moral, it is juridical, formalized, and measurable. A fringe but fascinating point. In some cases, lawyers and judges reportedly consulted medical or pseudo-medical experts to evaluate marital performance, drawing on anatomy, physiology, or humoral theory to determine whether obligations had been met. Imagine testimony about vigour, timing, or compatibility being presented in court, a surreal fusion of science, law, and morality. It's a reminder that duty-based sex is never purely intimate. It can be quantified, debated, and adjudicated. By now, a clear pattern emerges. Across centuries, sex as duty evolves from social, religious, and cultural expectation into legal codification. From Mesopotamia to Victorian England and the United States, obligation intersects with authority, hierarchy, and negotiation, shaping the private and public dimensions of intimacy. Legal systems formalize duty, yet human ingenuity, humour, and subtle resistance persist, revealing that agency and negotiation remain possible even under juridical oversight. As you imagine polished courtroom wood, the rustle of papers, and the tense spaces of marital negotiation, consider how law extends sexual duty beyond bedroom walls, creating new stakes, strategies, and anxieties. And as we move forward, we'll explore how missionaries in colonial societies further codified sexual obligation, blending local customs with religiously mandated duties in complex and sometimes coercive ways. Now, let's turn our gaze to colonial mission territories, where sex as duty is reshaped by cultural imperialism and religious instruction. Imagine yourself as a member of an indigenous community, or a settler family in the 18th or 19th century, where missionaries arrive with Bibles, catechisms, and meticulous instructions on proper moral behaviour, including marital intimacy. Here, sexual duty is not merely a social or familial obligation. It becomes a moralised, codified practice imposed by outside authorities. Refusal or deviation is framed as sin, disobedience, or moral failing. You probably won't survive this history without seeing how these interventions combined spiritual instruction with social control, profoundly shaping intimate life for generations. Missionaries often codified sexual behaviour, instructing couples on the frequency, purpose, and even timing of sexual relations. Procreation is emphasized as a sacred duty, with the goal of sustaining both family and faith. Indigenous practices were frequently suppressed or reframed to align with Christian moral frameworks, and sexual refusal could be interpreted as disobedience to God or the mission itself. Scholars debate whether these interventions were primarily coercive, educational, or a mixture of both. Some argue missionaries genuinely sought moral guidance and protection for communities, while others highlight the profound imposition of external norms, reshaping local sexual cultures and expectations in ways that reinforce patriarchal and colonial hierarchies. Here's a quirky detail. Missionary manuals sometimes included explicit illustrations of proper marital conduct and fertility advice, blending religious instruction with surprisingly practical guidance. You can imagine young couples nervously consulting a pamphlet on conjugal duties, trying to reconcile spiritual obedience with human desire. The mix of moral authority, pragmatic instruction, and occasional humour demonstrates how deeply duty and oversight were intertwined, even when filtered through ostensibly benevolent intentions. Now, picture the sensory environment. Small mission homes or settlements smell of candle wax, cooked grains, and pressed linen, while the faint aroma of incense or oils marks religious rituals. Inside the bedroom, objects such as crucifixes, prayer books, or modest furnishings silently signal that sexual acts are morally, socially, and spiritually significant. Every intimate encounter is layered with expectation: duty to spouse, duty to family, and duty to God. Even fleeting resistance or humour is constrained by spiritual and social surveillance, making negotiations subtle and often covert. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about the impact of missionary sexual instruction on indigenous populations. Did these teachings provide stability, mutual understanding, or moral guidance? Or did they disrupt pre-existing social norms, impose external authority, and suppress personal agency? Evidence suggests a mixture. Some couples adapted creatively, blending local practices with missionary guidance, while others faced tension, guilt, or fear. In either case, sexual duty becomes a point of intersection between local custom, colonial authority, and religious obligation. And here's a fringe yet fascinating point. In some mission records, women reportedly use prayer, ritual, or strategic compliance to subtly negotiate the timing and conditions of sexual obligation. These acts of personal agency reveal that even under strict moral and cultural impositions, humans persistently find ways to assert control, humour, or discretion in intimate life. Duty may dominate, but subtle strategy and negotiation remain. By now you should see a pattern. Across continents, cultures, and centuries, duty-based sex is continually reshaped by social, religious, and political pressures. In colonial missions, it is moralized, codified, and intertwined with power structures, yet human ingenuity and negotiation persist within these constraints. Your intimate life is never purely private. It is inseparable from culture, authority, and strategy. As you imagine the smell of incense, the quiet murmur of prayers, and the subtle negotiation of duty in candlelit rooms, consider how sexual obligation can be both deeply personal and socially mandated. And as we move forward, we'll explore the extreme pressures of wartime, where reproduction and intimacy are reframed as patriotic duties, adding yet another layer to the centuries-long story of sex as obligation. Now let's march into the brutal realities of wartime, where sex as duty becomes intertwined with patriotism, survival, and national strategy. Picture yourself in Europe during the World Wars, or in any conflict-ridden region where governments actively encourage reproduction to sustain the population, maintain the workforce, or even reinforce ideological narratives. In this context, sex is no longer purely marital, moral, or social. It is a civic and patriotic responsibility. Fertility becomes a tool of the state, and couples are subtly or explicitly pressured to fulfill conjugal duties for the greater good. You probably won't survive this history without recognizing how the intimate sphere is mobilized for national imperatives, merging obligation with ideology in ways that can feel simultaneously urgent and coercive. Governments and social institutions often framed reproduction as a duty, blending moral, social, and nationalistic rhetoric. Propaganda, posters, and public discourse encourage couples to have children, presenting childbirth as an act of service to one's country. In some cases, policies directly incentivized fertility, offering bonuses, medals, or privileges for families that produced multiple heirs. Scholars debate the ethical and psychological implications of these pressures. Some argue that civic duty strengthened family bonds, providing purpose amid hardship, while others highlight coercion, stress, and the reduction of intimacy to a nationalistic obligation. Either way, the personal act of sexual intimacy becomes inseparable from collective expectation. Here's a quirky yet revealing detail. In Germany during the Nazi regime, the Mother's Cross awarded women for producing multiple children reflects the literal intertwining of sexual duty and political reward. Imagine a society where every bedroom encounter has potential bureaucratic recognition, a surreal mix of honour, obligation, and public spectacle. While the context is extreme, it illustrates a recurring theme. Human sexuality is rarely private when it intersects with social, political, or economic imperatives. Now picture the sensory world of wartime domestic life. Houses are often dimly lit, rationed, and crowded, with the pervasive scent of coal smoke, canned food, and damp textiles. The distant roar of artillery, air raids, or marching troops permeates daily life, while children play under constrained conditions, and neighbours listen closely for whispered conversations. Within this environment, marital intimacy is both a private necessity and a public duty, influenced by fear, fatigue, and the constant presence of state or societal expectation. Every act carries personal, social, and national significance. There's an open scholarly debate about how these pressures affected relationships and sexual life. Did couples find shared purpose and emotional resilience in fulfilling patriotic duty? Or did the instrumentalization of intimacy produce resentment, anxiety, or trauma? Evidence points to a mixture. Some families cultivated a sense of duty that strengthened bonds, while others struggled under the weight of imposed expectation, fear, and loss. The wartime context amplifies the tension between desire and obligation, making every intimate encounter a negotiation of survival, duty, and emotion. Here's a fringe but fascinating point. Some soldiers and civilians reportedly devised clever ways to navigate reproductive expectations, using humour, timing, or secrecy to balance personal desire with patriotic obligation. These acts reveal the enduring ingenuity of human beings, even when sexual duty is tightly constrained by ideology, policy, or crisis. The interplay of compliance, strategy, and subtle resistance continues to define intimate life under extreme social pressures. By now, the pattern is evident. Across history, duty-based sex is continually shaped by context, social, political, religious, or economic, but humans consistently find ways to negotiate, adapt, and assert agency. Wartime reproduction demonstrates the high stakes of sexual obligation, where intimacy becomes civic duty, survival strategy, and ideological performance all at once. The bedroom, as always, is a site of negotiation, resilience, and sometimes subtle subversion. As you imagine dimly lit rooms, the pervasive scent of rationed meals, and the distant echoes of conflict, consider how sex as duty can expand beyond marriage or family to encompass national survival. And as we move forward, we'll explore the intersections of sex, obligation, and social roles in the context of prostitution, where duty becomes transactional and socially mediated in entirely different ways. Now let's step into the complicated and often morally ambiguous world of prostitution, where sex as duty becomes transactional, socially mediated, and deeply entwined with survival and social expectation. Picture yourself in a bustling 19th or early 20th century city, Paris, London, or New York, where economic necessity, social norms, and gender roles converge to dictate intimate behaviour. For many women, sexual labour is not a choice in the modern sense, but an obligation born from poverty, social pressure, or lack of alternatives. You probably won't survive this history without recognising how societal structures turn desire into duty and intimacy into a commodity, where obligation and survival intersect in ways that are both coercive and strategic. Prostitution in this era was heavily regulated, both socially and legally. Brothels, licensed houses, and even street solicitation were often monitored to enforce hygiene, moral standards, and taxation. Scholars debate whether regulation offered protection, empowerment, or further control. Some argue that legal oversight created a predictable framework for income and negotiation, providing women with a degree of agency, while others emphasize the coercion, stigma, and vulnerability inherent in a system that treats the body as both labour and social instrument. Either way, sexual obligation is no longer purely marital or familial. It is mediated by law, economy, and social hierarchy. Here's a quirky yet revealing detail. Some brothel guides and manuals provided instructions on timing, clothing, conversation, and performance, blending practical advice with humour and even hints at negotiation strategy. Imagine a young woman reading about best ways to handle a difficult client, alongside recommendations for fashion or etiquette. These texts illustrate that duty-based sex is not always purely coercive. Human ingenuity, humour, and subtle negotiation shape the experience, even within constrained social systems. The overlap of obligation, survival, and strategy creates a layered, sometimes absurd, but always human dynamic. Now picture the sensory environment. Narrow streets smell of coal, sweat, and baking bread, mixing with the faint perfume of passers-by. Brothel interiors are dimly lit by oil lamps, filled with the soft rustle of curtains and occasional music, while clients' footsteps echo in cramped hallways. The bedroom is both workplace and private arena, where negotiation, performance, and intimacy intersect. Every act is simultaneously an economic transaction, a socially mediated duty, and a performance shaped by personal agency, humour, and survival strategy. Sex becomes labour in the literal sense, with all the obligations, calculations, and human adaptation that entails. Historians debate the psychological and social effects of prostitution on duty-based intimacy. Did women develop agency, camaraderie, or clever strategies to manage expectations? Or did the constant social surveillance, stigma and obligation produce emotional strain and trauma? Evidence suggests both. Some women leveraged wit, charm and negotiation to assert boundaries, influence terms or maintain dignity, while others experienced intense pressure, exploitation or alienation. The interplay of duty, desire and survival underscores the complexity of sexual labour as a social and economic obligation. Here's a fringe yet fascinating point. Some studies of historical brothels indicate that workers created informal codes, humour and ritualised practices to navigate their obligations, such as scheduling techniques, shared knowledge of client preferences, or playful tricks to reduce discomfort. These subtle strategies show that, even in highly constrained and transactional forms of sexual duty, humans exercise ingenuity, humour, and negotiation. Duty may dominate, but agency persists in unexpected, creative ways. By now, the recurring theme is unmistakable. Across centuries, cultures, and social context, sexual obligation adapts, persists, and intersects with law, morality, economics, and survival. In prostitution, duty is codified through transaction and social expectation, rather than family, religion, or state. Yet the same principles of negotiation, adaptation, and subtle subversion remain. Intimacy, whether marital, civic, or transactional, is never purely private. It is always a site of obligation and human ingenuity. As you imagine narrow streets, dim oil lamps, and whispered negotiations, consider how sexual duty can extend beyond marriage and family into economic and social frameworks. And as we move forward, we'll explore religious conservatism in the 20th century, where sex as obligation persists even amidst expanding ideas of personal freedom, adding yet another layer of tension and negotiation. Now let's enter the world of 20th century religious conservatism, where sex as duty persists even amid growing notions of personal freedom and choice. Picture yourself in a small town or suburban neighbourhood in the 1950s or 1960s, where Sunday sermons, family expectations and community gossip all converge to shape marital life. Here, sexual obligation is moralised. Couples are instructed to fulfil marital duties, maintain fidelity, and procreate, often under the watchful eyes of clergy, neighbours, and societal norms. You probably won't survive this history without realising that even as cultural movements for autonomy and individual rights emerge, traditional notions of sexual duty remain stubbornly resilient, influencing bedroom behaviour and emotional life. Religious institutions continue to codify sexual obligations in marriage. Manuals, sermons, and church teachings emphasise that intimacy is both a moral responsibility and a sacred duty. Refusal of sexual duty can be interpreted as selfish, sinful, or even damaging to the marriage, reinforcing expectations of compliance. Scholars debate how these norms interacted with emerging ideas of personal liberty. Some argue that religious guidance provided moral structure and encouraged emotional stability within marriages, while others highlight the pressures it imposed, particularly on women, whose desire and autonomy were often subordinated to the ideals of duty and procreation. Either way, the tension between obedience and personal agency remains central. Here's a quirky detail. Some church-published guides included surprisingly practical instructions, such as advice on timing intimacy to avoid fatigue, using light humour to ease tension, or even small gestures to encourage cooperation. Imagine reading a pamphlet titled How to Fulfill Marital Duty Without Complaints, equal parts moral instruction and domestic strategy. It's a gentle reminder that even under rigid moral expectation, humans have always found ways to negotiate, mediate, and sometimes lighten the burdens of duty. Now picture the sensory world. Suburban homes smell of polished wood, baked goods, and fresh laundry, while the faint echo of hymns or neighbourhood activity reminds couples of the watchful social gaze. Bedrooms are modest, private yet morally charged spaces. The bed, nightstand, and framed family portraits silently enforce the expectation of reproductive duty and marital intimacy. Even small gestures, touch, attention, or humour, must navigate layers of obligation, morality, and social expectation. Intimacy is both personal and socially framed, a delicate negotiation between desire, duty, and propriety. There's an open scholarly debate about the emotional effects of this moralised obligation. Did structured religious expectations foster marital stability, predictability, and mutual understanding, or did they create guilt, repression, and emotional tension? Evidence suggests both. Some couples internalize the moral framework, developing mutual patience, humour, and subtle negotiation strategies, while others experience pressure and conflict, constrained by societal and spiritual expectations. Duty, morality, and affection intertwine, producing complex emotional landscapes. Here's a fringe yet fascinating point. Some historical accounts suggest that couples used coded humour, shared rituals, or playful strategies to negotiate sexual obligations while maintaining outward compliance with moral norms. Even within prescriptive religious frameworks, human ingenuity and subtle agency find a way to shape the experience of intimacy, balancing obligation and desire. Duty may dominate, but creativity and negotiation persist. By now, the pattern is evident. Across centuries and cultures, sex as duty adapts to social, moral, and institutional pressures, yet humans consistently navigate these obligations with ingenuity, humour, and subtle negotiation. In 20th century religiously conservative communities, moral frameworks codify obligation, yet personal agency and creativity continue to mediate the tension between duty and desire. The bedroom, once again, is both private and socially framed, intimate yet regulated. As you imagine the smell of fresh laundry, the quiet hum of suburban life, and the flicker of moral expectation, consider how duty persists even in a world increasingly shaped by personal freedom. And as we move forward, we'll explore changing gender norms, where the evolving understanding of sexual choice begins to reshape centuries of expectation and negotiation, creating new possibilities and tensions in intimate life. Now let's step into the shifting landscape of changing gender norms, particularly in the mid to late 20th century, where the concept of sexual choice begins to challenge centuries of duty-based expectation. Imagine yourself in the 1960s or 1970s, amid the whirlwind of women's liberation, the sexual revolution, and debates over consent, contraception, and marital equality. For many couples, these shifts are liberating, yet the weight of centuries of duty lingers. You probably won't survive this history without recognizing the tension between inherited social obligations and emerging ideas of personal freedom. Intimacy is no longer only a duty, it is also an arena for negotiation, consent, and self-expression, creating both opportunity and conflict. As gender roles evolved, expectations around sex began to change, though slowly. Women increasingly asserted autonomy over their bodies, challenging assumptions that marital sex was solely their duty. Men, meanwhile, were pressured to balance traditional expectations with emerging ideals of mutual pleasure, equality, and partnership. Scholars debate the pace and impact of this transformation. Some argue that women's empowerment immediately reshaped bedroom dynamics, fostering consent-based intimacy, while others note that cultural inertia, social pressure, and lingering religious norms maintained vestiges of obligation. Either way, this era introduces a new lens for understanding sexual duty, one in which choice, negotiation, and equality begin to coexist with tradition. Here's a quirky detail. Sex education pamphlets and advice columns from the 1970s sometimes blend humour, progressive ideas, and lingering duty-based language. One guide suggests that couples negotiate schedules, moods, and mutual satisfaction, while still reminding women of their responsibility to maintain the relationship. It's a fascinating snapshot of a transitional moment, where old and new ideas collide in awkward, creative, and often humorous ways. Even as social norms evolve, humans navigate both obligation and desire with negotiation, wit, and subtle strategy. Now, picture the sensory world of this period. Suburban or urban apartments smell of coffee, cigarette smoke, and fresh laundry, while the buzz of radios, televisions, or vinyl records fills the background. Bedrooms are more private than in previous generations, yet couples are acutely aware of social pressures, advice literature, and cultural expectations. Objects like contraceptives, books, and dim lamps signal both liberation and lingering responsibility. Intimacy is simultaneously private, negotiated, and socially influenced, with couples experimenting with balance between duty, desire, and autonomy. There's an open scholarly debate about the psychological effects of these shifts. Did greater autonomy foster stronger emotional bonds, mutual respect and fulfillment, or did the clash between tradition and liberation generate guilt, confusion or conflict? Evidence suggests both. Some couples embrace negotiation, consent and humour to balance changing expectations with familial and societal pressures, while others struggle to reconcile ingrained duty with newfound freedom. Sexual life became a negotiation not just between partners, but between generations, norms and ideals. Here's a fringe yet fascinating point. Some historical accounts suggest that couples experimented with contractual humour, joking about negotiating sexual obligations like chores or schedules, blending playfulness with negotiation in ways that echo practices from centuries of duty-based intimacy. Even in a period of increasing choice, humans rely on creativity, strategy, and subtle humour to navigate the tension between obligation and desire. By now, a clear pattern emerges. Across centuries, sexual duty evolves in response to social, cultural, and legal change. Yet humans consistently find ways to negotiate, subvert, and personalise obligation. Changing gender norms introduce choice, consent, and dialogue, but the legacy of centuries of duty still shapes expectation and behaviour. The bedroom, as always, becomes a site of negotiation, compromise, and subtle strategy, reflecting the enduring tension between societal expectation and personal desire. As you imagine the smell of coffee, the hum of vinyl records, and playful negotiations behind closed doors, consider how gender norms both liberate and constrain, creating a layered, dynamic landscape of intimacy. And as we move forward, we'll examine how modern legal frameworks continue to echo these historical obligations, shaping sexual life in surprising ways even today. Now let's examine modern legal echoes of sexual obligation, where centuries of duty-based expectations continue to ripple through courts, statutes, and social norms. Imagine yourself in the 21st century, where marriage laws, divorce proceedings, and family courts can still reference a spouse's sexual conduct or refusal of intimacy, though usually in more subtle or symbolic ways than in the past. Even as personal freedom and consent dominate public discourse, legal frameworks carry vestiges of historical expectation. Your bedroom life may be considered relevant to property disputes, divorce settlements, or allegations of neglect. You probably won't survive this history without realizing that law, culture, and morality continue to intertwine, shaping intimacy even in ostensibly liberal societies. Modern courts, particularly in common law countries, occasionally address sexual duty in cases of divorce or domestic dispute. Non-consummation, infidelity, or refusal of intimacy can still have indirect legal consequences for property division, custody, or alimony. Though explicit enforcement of sexual compliance is rare, scholars debate the significance of these residual legal expectations. Some argue that they subtly reinforce patriarchal notions of marital obligation, while others suggest that legal recognition can empower spouses, particularly in negotiating rights, consent, and protections. The enduring tension is clear. Sexual intimacy is treated both as a private matter and as a component of social, legal, and economic structures. Here's a quirky detail. In some legal textbooks or case commentaries, lawyers still cite centuries-old precedents, including the odd notion that a spouse can be coerced into fulfilling conjugal duties to preserve property or social contracts. While these cases are rare today, they reveal how deeply historical assumptions about duty persist in modern legal thinking. Imagine reading a court opinion that subtly references medieval or early modern ideas about sexual obligation. It's both amusing and unsettling, showing the persistence of centuries-old frameworks under a veneer of modern law. Now picture the sensory world. Courthouses smell of polished wood, paper, and faint coffee. Fluorescent lighting hums overhead. Outside, the modern city bustles, but inside, intimacy and obligation intersect in legal documentation, testimony, and negotiation. The bedroom remains private in practice, but the potential for legal scrutiny casts a long shadow. Every act of intimacy can carry consequences, whether symbolic, social, or juridical, highlighting the enduring relevance of duty even in a culture that prizes autonomy. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about the psychological and social impact of these residual expectations. Do they subtly shape behaviour, creating anxiety or performance pressure, or are they mostly symbolic remnants with minimal practical effect? evidence suggests a nuanced picture. Some couples internalize cultural and legal norms, affecting emotional dynamics and negotiation, while others navigate intimacy with greater autonomy, humour and mutual understanding. The interplay of historical expectation, law, and personal agency continues to frame sexual life. Here's a fringe but fascinating point. Some modern couples humorously reference historical legal precedents when negotiating intimacy, joking about ancient obligations or citing old-fashioned advice to lighten tension. This playful acknowledgement demonstrates that even legal structures rooted in duty can be mediated with humour, creativity, and personal agency. It's a contemporary echo of centuries-long patterns of negotiation, subtle rebellion, and adaptation within duty-based sexual frameworks. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. From Mesopotamia to the modern era, sex as duty evolves but never entirely disappears. Law, morality, culture, and personal strategy intersect, shaping intimacy in layered and dynamic ways. Modern legal systems reflect the persistence of obligation, yet human ingenuity, humour, and negotiation continue to create space for personal choice, consent, and creativity. The bedroom, as always, remains a site of layered expectations, where history, law, and individual agency intersect. As you imagine the hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of inked paper, and the quiet, formal negotiation of rights and obligations, consider how modern legal frameworks preserve echoes of centuries of sexual duty. And as we move forward, we'll explore the psychological legacy of duty-based sex, examining how these centuries of expectation shape intimacy, desire, and emotional life today. Now, let's explore the psychological legacy of duty-based sex, where centuries of expectation, obligation, and negotiation continue to shape intimacy, desire, and emotional life today. Imagine yourself sitting quietly in a modern bedroom, reflecting on how inherited social norms, family teachings, religious instruction, and legal frameworks all subtly influence your perceptions of sexual duty. Even in a world that emphasizes consent, autonomy, and pleasure, traces of historical obligation linger, sometimes as anxiety, guilt, or expectation, sometimes as strategies, humour, and negotiation learned over generations. You probably won't survive this history without noticing how deeply culture and history are embedded in the way we approach intimacy, shaping not only behaviour, but emotional and psychological experience. Modern psychology emphasises that duty-based sex can leave lasting imprints. For example, individuals may feel compelled to meet perceived obligations even when desire is low, experience guilt for resisting social or relational expectations, or develop complex strategies to navigate intimacy within layered expectations. Scholars debate whether these patterns are inherently negative or whether they can foster resilience, negotiation skills, and relational creativity. Some argue that awareness of historical pressures allows couples to consciously renegotiate patterns, creating healthier dynamics, while others caution that subtle, inherited expectations may still unconsciously influence behaviour, shaping satisfaction, consent, and communication. Here's a quirky yet revealing detail. Surveys in the late 20th century indicate that some couples jokingly reference obligatory intimacy when discussing schedules or marital expectations, blending humour with acknowledgement of lingering social pressure. Imagine partners laughing over historical patterns while negotiating bedtime or romantic attention. It's a playful yet poignant reminder that centuries of duty are remembered, adapted, and subtly transmitted across generations. Humour and negotiation remain essential tools for navigating inherited obligations. Now picture the sensory world of contemporary intimacy shaped by history. The bedroom smells of freshly laundered sheets, scented candles, or the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby cup. Modern technology, books, or personal objects subtly influence the mood and ritual of intimacy, while thoughts about social norms, familial expectations, or relationship dynamics hover in the background. Every act of intimacy is not just private. It resonates with centuries of social, moral, and familial guidance. Even the most personal choices are informed by layers of historical expectation, whether consciously or unconsciously. Scholars continue to debate the broader social consequences of this legacy. Do inherited expectations from centuries of marital duty create unnecessary pressure, anxiety, or conflict in modern relationships? Or do they provide a framework for negotiating boundaries, understanding roles, and fostering shared responsibility? Evidence suggests a nuanced picture. Some couples find these patterns constraining, while others use them as tools for organisation, humour, and mutual understanding. Duty-based frameworks can be both burdensome and enabling, depending on awareness, communication, and cultural context. Here's a fringe but fascinating point. Research on multi-generational family dynamics indicates that subtle norms around sexual obligation, such as beliefs about frequency, timing, or marital roles, can be transmitted unconsciously, influencing behaviour decades later. Even when individuals consciously reject duty-based expectations, family history can shape negotiation, preference, and emotional patterns in intimate relationships. It's a striking example of how deeply historical structures continue to inform modern sexual life. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. Duty-based sex is not simply a relic of the past. Across millennia, humans have navigated obligation, law, morality, and social expectation, and the psychological echoes of these patterns persist. Modern intimacy reflects a negotiation between inherited expectations, personal desire, and mutual consent, blending history with creativity, humour, and agency. The bedroom remains a site of layered influence, where centuries of social practice shape both emotion and action. As you imagine the scent of clean sheets, the hum of modern life outside, and the subtle awareness of historical legacy, consider how duty-based sex continues to influence behaviour, negotiation, and desire. And as we move forward, we'll reflect on this long journey in our final section, considering how understanding these histories reshapes the way we view consent, obligation, and intimacy today. Now let's draw together the threads of this long journey through time, where sex as duty has shifted, persisted, and evolved across cultures, legal systems, religions, and social structures. Imagine yourself sitting quietly, reflecting on millennia of human intimacy, from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the compact apartments of modern cities, from Spartan breeding programs to Enlightenment salons, from colonial mission houses to Victorian bedrooms. Across all these eras, a central tension emerges, the interplay between obligation and desire, social expectation and personal agency, duty and creativity. You probably won't survive this history without realizing just how profoundly these forces have shaped human sexual life, and how surprisingly resilient, inventive, and adaptive people have been in negotiating them. Consider the earliest societies, where marriage contracts literally codified sexual obligation. Wives were expected to bear children, husbands to provide intimacy, and both were accountable to family, community, and even the state. In Sparta, sex was a civic duty tied to the survival of the polis, while in Rome, law and social expectation made refusal of marital duty a potential source of legal consequence. Medieval Europe added religious moralization to these obligations, while the Renaissance layered conduct manuals, fertility advice, and ritualized behavior on top. Across centuries, duty intertwined with hierarchy, social strategy, and personal ingenuity, showing that even in the most rigid systems, humans found ways to negotiate, play, and adapt. Quirky and fringe facts abound along the way. Egyptian manuals suggested timing intimacy with lunar cycles. Renaissance guides compared husbands to cats creeping on the hearth, and colonial missionaries illustrated proper marital conduct to ensure obedience. Sometimes absurd, sometimes humorous, these details reveal human ingenuity in navigating obligation, even under extreme constraint. Humour, ritual, and strategy appear as constant companions to desire, subtly counterbalancing centuries of codified duty. The modern era, too, carries echoes of this past. Victorian moral codes, industrial labour pressures, legal oversight, wartime reproduction, and religious conservatism all reinforce the expectation of sexual duty. Yet human adaptation persists. Couples negotiate schedules, employ humour, assert agency, and engage in subtle resistance or playful compliance. Even contemporary legal frameworks, though emphasizing autonomy and consent, reflect centuries of historical expectation, influencing negotiation, perception, and emotional response. The psychological legacy is clear. Centuries of structured obligation continue to shape intimate life, often unconsciously, while personal creativity and humour provide enduring tools of navigation. Scholars continue to debate every aspect of this history: the degree of coercion versus adaptation, the balance between obligation and affection, and the emotional and psychological consequences of centuries of duty. Some emphasize the oppressive nature of historical frameworks, others highlight resilience, ingenuity, and the subtle ways humans maintained agency, humour, and emotional connection despite constraints. The truth, as always, lies in the interplay between structure and adaptation, between rule and negotiation, between societal expectation and individual desire. By now, you should see the overarching pattern. Duty-based sex is both universal and culturally specific, evolving yet persistent. Across millennia, human intimacy has been shaped by obligation, law, morality, survival, and social expectation, but the enduring presence of negotiation, humour, and strategy reveals that agency never disappears entirely. Each act of intimacy carries the weight of history, social context, and personal negotiation, reminding us that what may seem private is often layered with inherited expectation. As you reflect on this journey, from Mesopotamian tablets to modern bedrooms, from Spartan state directives to contemporary negotiations of consent, you begin to understand the deep complexity of sexual life. Duty has shaped, constrained, and guided desire, but human creativity, empathy, and ingenuity have always found a way to coexist within it. Recognizing this history reshapes our understanding of consent, obligation, and intimacy, allowing us to approach relationships with greater awareness, respect, and appreciation for the long arc of human experience.